Madison 1670 WTDY 905. Joining us now from Lawton and Cates, it's Jim Gardner. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
What is your phone number at Lawton and Cates?
282-6200, area code 608.
All right. I don't think we've had you on before, have we?
You have not.
All right. Well, it's good to have you on. The one thing the Republicans and the rapacious legislators from the Republican Party have not gotten to yet is medical malpractice. Now, we don't have many cases in Wisconsin, and we talked about this in a year. How many medical malpractice cases are there?
Well, I looked it up, and since 1975, we've been averaging less than 200 a year. In the last 5 years in Wisconsin, it's been less than 150.
Okay. Now, of those 150, how many people actually win a case?
The last statistic I saw, plaintiffs recovered somewhere between 10 and 15% of the time.
Boy, we sure have a litigious society, don't we?
We certainly do.
And then the nice thing is in the state of Wisconsin, we have a fund that when there are damages, that the doctor doesn't go broke, right? And we've kept insurance rates down for doctors.
In Wisconsin, we have sort of a unique system. The doctor himself has to carry $1 million worth of personal insurance. Thereafter, the state of Wisconsin fund covers everything. So there is no personal responsibility for the doctor.
All right. Jim Gardner with Lawton and Cates with us, Madison 1670 WTDY. So doctors prevail 85% of the time. So when you hear that we live in a litigious society, you need to stuff that in that person's mouth. Now, let's get to negligence. In order to sue a doctor, what do you have to prove?
You have to prove two things. You have to prove that the doctor was negligent, and you have to prove that the negligence caused an injury. That seems to be intuitive, but it's really not. Those are both expert-driven issues. The only way you can prove the doctor was negligent is to hire another doctor to testify.
And doctors don't really like to go after other doctors.
They do not. So you're normally talking about hiring a doctor from out of state, or at the very least, if it's a Madison case, going to Milwaukee.
Right. I did not know Lawton and Cates did personal injury.
Lawton and Cates does a lot of personal injury.
Do you?
I've been doing personal injury work for 40 years.
All right. So when it comes to damages, and one of the things you have to assess is whether there's enough damages that can be recouped to make the case worth it, right?
That's correct. In a medical negligence case, because it is so expert-driven, the attorney is looking at paying costs $50,000, $70,000 out of pocket that the attorney has to advance to move the case. If the attorney loses, he loses $50,000 to $70,000.
So there's a lot of cases that don't move forward.
There's a lot of cases that are never brought. And what happens is you can only bring a case where you're talking about catastrophic injuries or very, very serious injuries. If you have a case where the injuries are $100,000 or $150,000, if you think that's the value, economically you can't bring that case.
So you know the right questions to ask.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
normally.
Because you obviously don't want to waste the firm's money or your time in this case. But it's more difficult than it was 30 years ago.
Oh, it's much more difficult than it was 30 years ago. I would say I probably take 90% of the medical malpractice inquiries that come into our firm. I would say 90% of the inquiries we get, I say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Not because I don't think you have a viable case, but it's one I either think we can't win or economically it doesn't make sense.
Give me an example, Jim, of cases where it doesn't have to be somebody's specific case. Give me of a hurdle that a lot of cases can't cross.
Well, if you're talking about an economic nature, say someone falls down, an unemployed person breaks their hand, breaks a thumb. The thumb is improperly set, so you have limitations of motion and strength. but you're a stay-at-home mother. So basically, you don't have an economic loss. There's no future medical expense.
Oh.
So you have pain and suffering.
It kind of seems like we're putting a value on someone's life based on how much they make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the medical malpractice area, everything is capped except the cost of medical care and the economic loss, wage loss. Anything else has caps on it, and you can't recover above the caps.
We hear a lot about Jim Gardner with Lawton and Cates with us here in Madison 1670 WTDY. We hear a lot about settlements, right?
You hear a lot about them. They very seldom occur in the medical negligence area. One, doctors win 85% of the time.
So why settle, right?
Why settle? Secondly, when the law was first instituted back in 1975, they included a rule in it, which I believe they thought was a consumer rule, that if a doctor paid a negligence case, he would be investigated by the state of Wisconsin Department of Regulation and Licensing. So doctors can't settle if they want to avoid being investigated. So if you have a good doctor who just happens to make a mistake, he will fight tooth and nail to avoid that investigation.
It occurred to me as we speak here that this is really troubling, not for people that are going to sue, but for people trying to find out who the good doctors are.
It's difficult. It's very difficult. There are some rating systems out there. There are more
there's websites.
Websites.
Yeah.
But quite frankly, I think the best way to find a good doctor is word of mouth. Talk to, if you trust your family doctor, talk to him or her about a surgeon you're going to go see or a specialist.
We certainly had a case with the Supreme Court. Conservatives got very angry with Patrick Crooks. They threw out the limits that the legislature had put on. Right. Explain that.
Well, what had happened is there were limits on pain, suffering, and disability. And because they were quite stringent, the Supreme Court threw those limits out as saying they were a violation of equal protection. The legislature went back and instituted new limits on pain, suffering, and disability. And those limits are now $750,000, and they're not tagged to any inflation. So it's a straight $750,000 is all you can recover for pain, suffering, and disability.
That's incredible. That's not really very much money.
That's not very much money at all. If, say, for instance, you have someone who I represented someone recently who was brain damaged due to medical negligence. The total amount he'd never work again, never walk again, frankly, very limited speech. The total amount of pain, suffering, and disability he could recover was $750,000. All
right. So when Republicans do eventually bring this up, what do you think they're going to do?
It's hard to know. They could decrease the cap.
And then hope that the new Supreme Court rules differently. Because it's a different Supreme Court now than
it is a different Supreme Court. And if Prosser prevails in the recount, there are 4 pretty solid votes.
I know. They were in the assembly parlor when he was declaring victory, acting like a scrum of rugby players.
That's true.
It was actually quite appalling. He seems to think that he's still in the legislative body.
He does, and he was thanking his 3 other conservatives on the court.
Patience Rogensack, of course, Annette Ziegler, and Michael Gableman.
That's it.
That'd be the tribe.
That would be the tribe, and those are the folks who are very much predisposed to rule against individuals and in favor of the medical profession.
You know what amazes me about this is that I know they do this because they have a reflexive support for insurance companies and doctors, but sometimes Republicans are patients. And sometimes Republicans are damaged by doctors or treated poorly by insurance companies. So it's hard for me sometimes to fathom why their free market philosophy of keeping government out of things stops right here when it comes to government putting a cap. It seems to be the antithesis of the rest of their ideology.
Well, I don't think they have to be ideologically consistent. I frankly think they know where their contributions come from, and that's the way they go. And furthermore, what person thinks it's ever going to happen to them?
Right. If it does happen to you, you better go find a good lawyer and find out whether your case can clear those hurdles, because the last thing you want to do is make a mistake.
Absolutely.
All right. What's your phone number again?
Area code 608-282-6200.
Great. It's great having you on the show, Jim.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Come back, all right?
I will.
Jim Gardner from Lawton and Cates with us, 1670 WTDY. Every day it gets crazier in Fitzwalkerstan.
Slide.